Welcome to another episode of the Just Make Art podcast. Today's episode is going to be all about Jack Whitten. Now, this is not our first episode about Jack, and it's safe to say at this point it won't be our last. Both Ty and I are massive fans. We've been talking about this book, Notes from the Woodshed, for quite a while. If you have not yet read this book, just please do yourself a favor. If you only read one art book in 2026, make it this one. If you buy it and read it and don't love it, I will refund whatever you paid for it. Now, you do have to return it back to me so that I can regift it to somebody else, but that's my you'll love it guarantee. Please go get this book. Now, for today's episode, we've got a special guest host, Jamel Wright Sr. And Jamel's somebody who I've got a tremendous amount of admiration and respect for as both an artist and just a human being. He's become a great friend of mine over the last few years. Jerry Saltz in How to Be an Artist says, form a coven. We talked about that in our Jerry episode. And I take that to mean that it is our responsibility as artists to surround ourselves with other artists who both challenge and inspire us. And Jamel definitely does both of those things for me. Over the last few years, we've had a lot of wide-ranging conversations about art, and I'm just grateful to call him a friend and a mentor. I know Jamel well at this point, but you may not, so let me give you a proper introduction. Jamel Wright Sr. is an Atlanta-based visual artist and professor whose work investigates the intersections of landscape, memory, and diasporic abstraction. Born and raised in Ohio, Wright moved to Atlanta at age 22, where he became an important organizer of art, jazz, and poetry events throughout the city. Seeing that many young artists lacked meaningful platforms, he founded the Neo-Renaissance Art House, a grassroots gallery that nurtured and elevated a new generation of emerging creatives. This experience led him toward his own artistic path. Wright earned a BA in art history from Georgia State University, focusing on African and American contemporary art, and later completed an MFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Wright's studio practice spans Georgia red clay, Dutch wax cloth, gesture drawing, and large-scale textile installations. His work explores presence, duration, and the in-between as active structures within Black experience, often merging material experimentation with ecological and historical inquiry. He has exhibited widely, including solo exhibitions at the Gibbs Museum of Art in Charleston and the Albany Museum of Art, and his work is held in collections across the region. Wright has participated in residencies at Surf Point Foundation, the Vermont Studio Center, and Mass MoCA. And he received the Wingate Artist Fellowship at the Zuckerman Museum of Art. His public commissions include major works for the Montgomery Museum of Art and Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. As a faculty member at Clark Atlanta University, Wright teaches studio practice, African American art history, writing, and professional development. He recently co-curated Inner Visions, an exhibition on Black abstraction at the Clark Atlanta University Art Museum. He approaches Notes from the Woodshed with a deep connection to Jack Whitten's devotion to process, improvisation, and the studio as a site of becoming. And I'll just add, Jamel's work is tremendous, so please go check it out. He can be found on Instagram at Art the New Religion. We've had a lot of conversations like this. Most of them aren't recorded. This one was, so I really hope you enjoy it. Mel, let's dive in.
Hey, let's dive in.
We've been talking about this for a while.
Yes.
And I have been really looking forward to it. I'm super excited to have this conversation. I have to, first off, just thank you for recommending this book to me. I had heard of it before, but in one of our conversations, you're like, you got to read this book. And it has been a game changer for me. So I got to thank you for that. I was trying to recall and when we first met. I think it was Ty actually who connected us somehow. And I believe it was when I was going to be, I was about to be in Atlanta to do a project, and I asked Ty, "Hey, who do we know?" And when I say who do we know, I'm asking him who does he know in Atlanta, right. And that's kind of how we started chatting. But I guess let's jump in with this. Maybe just give a broad overview, just your experience with Whitten's work, and specifically, what do you love about this book, Notes from the Woodshed, that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, I'll start off by adding to what you were saying about me suggesting the book to you was kind of based off of, what I was seeing in your practice and how you work with materials. And thinking about Jack Whitten and the way that he worked with materials, the way that he worked with paint, the way he experimented with paint, the way he was creating devices or creating tools to work with paint. He was always rediscovering paint. So I thought that those two, with you and with that, would be a really good connect. The book, or Jack Whitten's practice, we think about the 2,000 years of painting, right? Abstraction probably started around 1870 with, like, I believe, with J.W. Turner. When you look at some of his seaside paintings and the way, if you look at the backgrounds of those paintings, then you'll see these kind of notes of abstraction. It almost feels like, knowing what we know now, it almost seems like he was bubbled on something, but he didn't know how to quite do it because the camera hasn't really been invented yet, or hasn't really been explored yet. So you can't really leave the history paintings or landscape paintings or pictorial figurative painting. Then you have Monet, who does like these gesture paintings where they're not calling it gesture yet. He's just trying to show us the light, the way the light looks upon an object. Not the object. He's not as invested in the object as much as the light and the way that it appears on that object, and how the light then reflects the color of the object that he is painting. Mm-hmm. So he's able to do something where most people had not done before, was that was coloring shadows, where typically shadows were always just black. But he was able to find like the blue in a shadow, or these additional colors in shadow. So you have like these early kind of precursors of like the Impressionists that were kind of verging on like abstraction. And then you have Cézanne, who is kind of verging on removing the figure as he's continuing to paint this mountain. And as he paints the mountain and the landscape even more, you can see how the houses just become shapes and the mountain just becomes a shape. And then he's kind of breaking it apart. It's not so much about the mountain as much as it is about the act of painting, the practice of painting, and the practice of excavating this, this landscape that he's doing consistently, because Cézanne was painting this mountain consistently. And then we have like Cubism. Cubism was kind of like blocking things out, and then you have Cubism that begins to break down the form and flatten it. So when you have George Barak and Picasso breaking down the figure, when you see Matisse and Picasso start looking in the African mask. So there's this interesting catalyst that's happening at this time, where these ideas of painting are now leaving the photograph and leaving the figure. And now we're just really thinking about painting, but we still aren't sure, like, what does it truly look like to leave the figure or an object or a landscape? And then something magical happens. Norman Lewis, Jackson Pollock, when he looks at a painting that he completes with Lee Krasner and says, is this even a painting? So we had to go through surrealism. We had to go through Dada. We had to go through these things that are allowing us now, Kandinsky, who is using synesthesia. So that's what Kandinsky had, where he's able to do that. So, and then you have Helmut Klemp, who does, begins with geometric abstraction, and then Jenny Strobel, who kind of starts these splatters, and then Jackson Pollock sees those and begins to explore that. And now we're starting to see where the camera no longer has influence in the painter's life. And then people are now, because of Duchamp, are no longer thinking about painting for anyone else. It becomes individualized. And now we're trying to express how we're feeling, which is really interesting because this is happening after World War I, World War II, the wars that will end all wars. And because of that, then you have these different kind of explorations that's happening. So by the time we get to Jack Whitten, we're talking about civil rights, We're talking about the fact that, he was born in Bessemer, Alabama, and Birmingham, Alabama, which I find really interesting because here you are in the Jim Crow South. Here you are dealing with not only racism, but, he called it apartheid. He's seen Klansmen, he's seen lynching, then he goes to Tuskegee where he got an opportunity to be a pre-med. So that kind of gives you a hint that he believes in an experiment. He believes in exploring. He's, and in a time where America has been explored and conquered and colonized, he becomes a modern day explorer. But he changes the medium, right? It's no longer land, but it is this kind of ephemeral, liquidy, plasticky substance called painting. And when it gets to him, at first he's trying to fully express himself through the paint. And then he finds that that's not enough. And that's what we see in his life, this kind of quest to create something that kind of, I believe, opens it up to what is not a painting that is referential to the past 2,000 years of painting, but that is truly, as he says in the book, a Jack Whitten painting.
He was acutely aware of of his place in historical context.
Right.
And that's really evident throughout the book. It's interesting, as when you were mentioning his passion, his drive to develop something that was uniquely his, and his use of tools to accomplish that. I was thinking, I know I shared this with you because I called you shortly after visiting the show at MoMA this past summer. And one of my favorite things about that show was seeing the developer.
Right.
They had, and so, being a nerd when it comes to process and tools, just looking at the way that he constructed that. And I don't know which iteration that was. I don't imagine it was his first attempt, to make that particular version, but yeah, that was absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
We talked about painting or making art as a solo sport. I often call it a solo sport because you spend so much time alone.
Yeah.
But I would also say that making art is really built on community as well. He had a really strong community. Adger Goings, who was making paintings with his comb, is where Jack Whitten began to see another way of making a painting. And he began to make these comb paintings, these pick paintings, right? Hair pick paintings. Mm-hmm. And then the rumor is that him and, I just had his name, William de Kooning. People call him Bill. But William de Kooning became friends with, and I think that William de Kooning is actually kind of interesting too, because William de Kooning is actually friends with a lot of the African-American contemporary painters during that time. That oftentimes
I got to jump in. De Kooning was Dutch.
Oh, Dutch. Okay, great.
Yeah. Those are my people. I'm like 3/4 Dutch.
Well, you live in Minnesota.
Anytime you see a D or a van, or there's a number of others that's a telltale sign. Almost always. It's
great
from the Netherlands.
So, but those guys, when it came to painting, they would show these paintings of the New York School of painters, and Norman Lewis was one of those painters. But oftentimes they would have Norman Lewis stand on the side, and then they would cut him out of the paintings so that it would look like this New York School of painters were all white. I say that because they all used to meet at the same bar, the Cedar Bar, along with the African American painters, and they all would talk together. They all knew who each other were. But the New York School versus these African American artists are often excluded from these conversations.
He was a member of the Irascibles.
Yeah.
But was not on that iconic photo.
Right. So Norman Lewis is considered one of the first abstract expressionist painters. First Black ones. But then when you go down this line and you look at who is alongside of de Kooning. There were people like Joe Overstreet. There was Ed Clark. There was Jack Whitten. There was a whole school of painters alongside of Agar Goings, who, like I had already mentioned, but Al Loving. There were all these abstractionists that were around the same time who were contributing to each other. And I believe were contributing to this New York School of Artists as well. Mm-hmm. Because then you have the younger generation, which is the Rauschenbergs and the Jasper Johns, the Cy Twombly's, Joseph Alberts, who's kind of an outlier to all of that, but he's influencing the way we look at color. When we go back to New York School, talk about Rothko, all these people knew each other. They were in conversation. So to say that like artist is just discovering on his own, you know, there were many discoveries that were happening. There was many conversations that are happening. And Jack Whitten mentions, you know, some of his conversations with de Kooning in the book. But I was saying all that to say that de Kooning, the story is that de Kooning helped Jack Whitten create the developer. He told him he needed a tool. But other sources that were close to Jack Whitten at that time says Joe Overstreet helped him to develop this tool. So we have these different sources, these different witnesses to what's happening during this time to create these new languages, right? So, yeah, so I think that helps to kind of give us some context when we're talking about the book, is kind of having some of this background information.
Absolutely. I want to come back to something that you mentioned earlier, just because I'm curious. We'll get to the book at some point, probably.
Great.
But I'd love to hear you unpack that idea. I think I know what you mean when you say that art is a solo sport that also involves community, but I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Well, I mean, art being a solo sport means that like you spend a lot of time in the studio by yourself. It's like, for me, my practice is probably like 90% research and 10% actually making the thing. Mm-hmm. What people see is the 10% in a very large scale. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes people don't know how long it took me to get to that. I'm currently researching some stuff now, and I've been researching it for like maybe 2 or 3 months of just like reading and resourcing and selecting materials and trying some stuff and it not being that successful. And then, you know, eventually I'll be trying some more stuff here soon. And then that won't even be that great. And then I'll finally get to a point where I have the opportunity to really like do it the way I want to do it. And then it's going to be rock'em sock'em, right? But the thing is, like, people don't see that part of it. And that part of it kind of takes community. That part kind of takes like me having conversations with you about materials, me calling up Ty and asking him how he did this thing. Mm-hmm. Me calling Golden and saying, hey, I'm thinking about this type of paint, or I'm thinking about the way to use this paint. Can I do this to it? Or is there a medium that I can do that to it? It's hanging out with some friends and, you know, maybe they'll come to the studio and we'll smoke a cigar and we'll be looking at a painting that I've done. And they'll go, hey, have you thought about this? But all the prep work is solo. All the painting part is solo. I can't have people in the studio while I'm making. They just, at this point, they just get in the way. Yeah. You know, people asking questions. Why are you using that blue rather than the other blue? You know, like, why don't you flip it over? Doesn't this painting look better on its side? I don't need that conversation with you right now. Like I was telling a friend, look, I'm just trying to learn how to make the thing. Let me learn how to make it first, and then we can start critiquing it. And I think that a lot of times people, like even when I say learning how to make it, most people would think like, well, you already know how to paint. Yes, I know how to paint, but there's a certain thing that you're trying to get to in a painting and you want it to resonate in a certain way. Like there's a quote in here There's a quote. It's on page 63. He says, I got some pretty good paintings, but it did not please my third eye. Meaning that I can do some really great paintings, but they haven't really hit the mark that I'm trying to get it to hit.
Yeah. Right.
You know? So I can do 15 of those until I finally get to that one, like, okay, this is it.
That's it.
What did I do? What did I do differently on this one that I hadn't done in the past 15 paintings, right?
Yeah.
And you start building these kind of recipes, right? These kind of recipes for painting. And then once you get that recipe down, then you're like, okay, it's clicking. And that 15th one really becomes your first one. And then you start making the other paintings. And then you start going, okay, I got it now. I got it. And that's when you've learned how to make the painting. And also, when people come see it, they're not questioning it anymore. They can go, wow, that's something. And then at that point, you've done maybe after you get that 15th one, then you do your next 10 to solidify the fact that you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then 10 is when you can really start talking about what it is you did, what questions you're asking, where are you trying to place yourself, where do these paintings placed in history, where are you placed in the canon, what are you trying to achieve? And Jack Whitten's talking about that throughout. He's talking about like using a developer and how he did like 3 or 4 paintings that day, but they didn't quite hit it. Or he did like 10 paintings, but he only liked 2. And that's why, like, you know, I look at your book and you've read it completely, what, twice now?
At least.
And I've gotten through half of it because I'm really meditating on things that he's saying. And I'm really in the place where he was in my practice, where when he's saying something, it just makes me go, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. But I need to kind of like really kind of fill this out in my day to day.
Yeah.
And then me get back to the studio and make some things. So almost like I feel like sometimes I'm in conversation with Jack Whitten as opposed to just reading a book. Sometimes I feel like when I'm reading it, it's like he's talking to me. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Makes perfect sense. Yeah. Okay. So what do we do next?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's the book it's so dense with the deepest of gems and nuggets.
Right.
We talked about this the other day when we were talking about planning for the episode here, but you know, we could literally close our eyes and open up any page.
Right.
And I'm curious to ask you what your more, you gave me I wrote like 7 things down that I want to ask follow-up questions on from what you just shared. But
sure,
you know, when you talk about research, a big part of that for me is journaling and writing, listening to the work. You know, one of the things that I've done with this book is taken things that I've highlighted and you know, this book is all marked up and I've got, you know, things that I've written down. I just opened up to a page,
right.
bunch of ideas, one of 7 of which I've executed. That's actually a good idea. I should try that. But I've used it as a almost like a prompt, you know, for journaling. I'll write what Jack wrote, and I'll just reflect on it and try to absorb it and receive, you know, the deep wisdom that's in it. Yeah. So sorry.
Yeah.
I was going to put that in form of a question. So talk more about what research means for you and for your practice. Is journaling a part of it? Like what else?
In a way, my undergrad is art history. Mm-hmm. So research to me is real, like in-depth research. I believe that my making is a continuation of my making. So like if I did Dutch wax paintings dealing with batik, then I started thinking, okay, well, I want to make my own batiks. So then I learned how to hand dye fabric and then do batiking. And then I said, okay, well, I did that. Now I want to do like really large scale pieces, hand dye in different colors, and then add in some batiking and some discoloration. And I was like, well, what could I dye these in earth? Can I use red clay because red clay stains? Can I dye these in red clay? And I did that. Can I paint on top of that? What does that look like? Okay, so now I've done that. Let me learn how to do some other painting techniques. What if I stain the surface rather than just paint on it? What if I stained it first? Mm-hmm. Looking at Peter Bradley and Helen Frankenthaler, how does that look in comparison to just painting it, right? Mm-hmm. What do I develop out of that? And I'm note-taking these things. I'm looking at these artists. If I'm looking at staining, I'm looking at Peter Bradley. If I'm looking at like Sam Gilliam, I'm Al Loving. I look at William T. Williams because of the way that he uses these directional forms. I look at J.W. Turner a lot, Robert Duncanson, landscape painting. So I'm thinking about landscapes, thinking about how we're into the land. Over the past couple of years, I've been researching landscape painting versus abstraction. Thinking about historical paintings, thinking about Amsel Kiefer, again, Robert Duncanson, Edward Bannister, J.W. Turner, Winslow Homer, like those guys right there are kind of like in the background of my thinking. But the methodology that I'm using is abstraction. So then I start thinking about Joe Overstreet. Joe Overstreet was really interesting because he did something called vernacular architecture. So he's reshaping the canvas, having it hover in space. He currently has a show in Mississippi that I want to go to. It was in Houston at the Benil Collection, and I missed it. There's that. And then Sam Gilliam and Al Loving, they kind of like teach me about color. But when I'm looking at form, I'm thinking about like Cy Twombly and gesture painting, Basquiat, the way that Basquiat was able to level the surface, like he could put the figure there and put the gesture there, the hand gesture there, and even them out. Like he's the first person that's been able to like balance the figure and the gesture, that abstraction at the same time.
Yeah.
I guess I'm really kind of giving you a lot of my secrets, but not really. The thing is like I'm studying these painters, but the side part of that is I'm currently looking at the American South within the context of landscape painting, and then particularly Georgia, because I live in Georgia. So I'm thinking about like, what is the land? How does the land offer, like the land of Georgia in contrast to the Hudson River School painters? So that's kind of like where I've been for the past 2 or 3 years. So when you look at a painting like, is it Siberian Salt by Jack Whitten? When you're looking at those huge like swipe paintings, the developer paintings, thinking like even he says, I'm not trying to create a landscape. I'm trying to get away from the landscape, right? Yeah. But I'm kind of interested in the landscape because I'm kind of like next door to where he used to live. My parents are actually from Birmingham, Alabama. So understanding that landscape and understanding artists like Thornton Dahl and Lonnie Holly, I really see myself as like, how do I gather all these artists that I've mentioned, put them in a box, or do like we used to do when I used to work in restaurants, where you get a glaze, you have to boil everything down till it's just like a sauce, and then make that sauce. So I'm thinking about the research as opposed to how we deal with the land. What is the land? Why is the land? Why do we think about the land in this way? So a very theoretic idea of what does land mean and our position in the land and who are we amongst the land, in the land. I think about that. But then I'm also thinking about these painters and how they work their practice. And then how do I then meld those two things together?
When people ask you,
a lot.
It's a lot. I love it. We're in it. We're doing it.
We're in it. Yeah, we're in it.
When people ask you, while looking at your work, how long did this take you? How do you answer that?
I actually, when people ask me what I do, I actually just tell them I'm a college professor. I stopped talking about being an artist to most people because of that like 15 minutes it took me to kind of explain to you like how I'm getting to a painting.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
The average person's not really interested in all that material.
Right.
They're just kind of asking me like, okay, so how long did it take for you to make that?
Right.
Yeah, but it's been taking me 2 or 3 years to even figure out what it is I wanted to make. It's been taking me experiment after experiment of learning how to dye, buying all the materials so I could dye in my backyard.
Right.
I spent a whole summer outside 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night, hand dyeing fabric.
Right.
So like, how long does it take for me to make that? Like, it's really kind of like this American concept of trying to quantify time.
Yes.
And trying to put my thought process in the context of capitalism.
Yeah.
Because they want me to be able to qualify and quantify my time to justify them buying, or I call it investing, in an idea that will then lead to another idea.
Right.
As if every painting is a proposal, as opposed to every painting being an opportunity for the viewer to see something in life that they've never seen before.
Yeah. That is a very industrial, linear sort of thinking, right? A leads to B leads to C. And it is almost, I ask that question, obviously tongue in cheek, because it's a question that we all get all the time.
Right.
And it's like,
right.
I say 50 hours, somewhere between 50 hours and 46 years. It's all of it.
I say, like when they ask me about the Dutch wax paintings that I do, I would often tell them, if I'm really getting good on it, it takes me about 4 days, but a lot of it is waiting for paint to dry.
Right.
I know how to make them well enough now that I can I get those done. The other abstract work that I do, it has to do with now once you learn how to make it, I mean it gets faster, but still there's waiting on paint to dry. And I don't like to really involve myself with the forcing of a painting.
Right.
I like to kind of allow the painting to tell me what it wants to do, and then I adjust to that.
Yeah. Yeah. You said something before that caught my attention. You said, okay, I did that. Now I want to do this.
Right.
And that's something that reoccurs all throughout, Jack's work, obviously, and his writing about his work. Okay, I did that. Now on to this,
Right.
Sort of what if, what's next? You talk about the time it took you it takes us to get to that first work of a series of a new vein that works, and then the time it takes to do the subsequent 10. It's a very different time domain.
Yeah, and the advantage is that we're standing on Jack Whitten's shoulders, right? Mm-hmm. So we know how he made that. Right. We have an idea. We have a book where he goes through like his ideology. So we have a cheat code to some degree. We know how Joe Overstreet made his work. We know how Al Loving made his work. Ed Clark, de Kooning, Rothko. We have their recipes.
Yeah.
So you could almost, to some degree, stop there if you really wanted to, and say that there's no reason, to paint anything else. I mean, that's the reason why Duchamp started like, hanging shovels in the gallery space, because he began realizing that there's everything beautiful has already been made. But I think that's where we're just at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason why I'm like rediscovering the Hudson River School. Like often in my practice, I go like, why am I so, rather than trying to make something new, why am I going back to these older concepts?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that they're cyclical, cyclical
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that we're discovering new things. We're in a new age. We're in a new era of technology. Like
Yeah.
I don't really believe that the world's going to end and then the whole world's going to be burnt up and then people will be gathered up. I believe that people are being gathered up every day. But I also believe that sometimes the world ending is a season, is a time of technology, right? Where like Rome ended, Greece ended, Egypt ended. And right now we're at a place where technology is changing the world. So the era of learning how to write cursive is over. The era of doing math by hand is over. And even to some degree, the era of thinking for yourself for a lot of people is over.
Yeah.
We now have AI. We now have all these other things that are telling us what to, social media, all these things that are telling us what to think, how to think, and why to think that way. And it's easier oftentimes to kind of submerge yourself and just go along with it and just submit.
Hold on. Are you
But
suggesting that using prompts is not thinking for yourself?
no, I'm saying when the prompt is yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, so I kind of think of to this modern era that we're in is a new Hudson River School.
Hmm.
It is a time to look at the land as a wonder.
Yeah.
To explore something new, to explore new ideas. I don't plan on colonizing painting, but I do think about excavating painting. I don't think about dehumanizing other cultures. My intent is to include other cultures and see where those things meet.
Yeah.
And they meet in me. And I think that that's where Jack Whitten, again, learning to make a Jack Whitten painting, something that's not African American, something that's not Eurocentric, something that's not American. One of these things he says, may the history of Western painting die within me.
Yeah.
Page 95. These kind of ideas that like, let's start anew, which I think is kind of bold. I think that's what makes painters or artists kind of really different than most people. This ambition to make something so new that's never been seen before. But there's a lot of pain in that. There's a lot of pain in making something that no one's ever seen before because no one's ever seen it before. So they don't really know how to deal with it. You often are waiting for people to understand what you're making and seeing how consistent you are about making it.
Right.
The pain of doing that. Even there's a section in here, I didn't put it in the notes, where he says that like, I'm about to start a new series. I was going to take these last couple of pieces from this last series to a gallery, but no one wants the last pieces to a series, right? They don't want to see the end. They only want the new,
You talk about that's such a, sorry to cut you off, but that's such a,
you're fine.
May the history of Western painting die within me. That is incredibly bold. That is incredibly
It
ambitious,
is.
about as bold and ambitious as it gets. One of the things that's so fascinating about this book, so he wrote that in 1975.
Right.
We read that today, right, with everything that he did after that in the rear view, right, for
Right.
context, and it makes sense. You're like, yeah, that makes sense that Jack would have been thinking that then. But these are his journal entries,
Right.
This is not something that he was publishing at the time, or
Right.
probably
Exactly.
sharing with anyone, let alone a select few, right? So that's a really interesting thing, is that's what's so great. And we've recommended this book so many times. Like, if you only read one book in 2026, just read this book. It's so good. But just that insight into his thought process and some of the sort of just audacious, big thinking, that one needs to entertain to even have a chance at getting close.
Yeah, and we can't skip also some of the racial undertones that are happening there too, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can't gloss over the fact that not only is he talking about Western painting, he's also talking about Western ideas, right? He's talking about the fact that his body is the black body has been subjugated. He can't,
Mm-hmm.
The fact that until he goes to the North, does he have access to abstraction because of the figure being so prominent in the South, and the figure meaning the black body, meaning the labor of the South, the way that we look at the South as far as a place where slavery was. And we forget that slavery was actually in Washington, D.C., it was in Virginia, it was in many parts of America. And he is kind of like escaped some of it to some degree, where he's goes to Cooper Union and gets a degree in art making and then becomes an artist in New York. He's not tending to the South, but he is remembering the South. I was watching this thing where his wife was saying he didn't tell everything that happened to him in the South, but you can see it, right?
Yeah.
Like you could hear it. Like some of those first paintings that he did was talking about Martin Luther King because he was marching along with Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
So he was, even though his work does not appear to be civil rights driven, by him making this kind of work becomes activism.
Yeah.
Because he's showing that Black people can think too. Because that's what abstraction really is. I mean, abstraction is about thinking. It's about, like, Jackson Pollock, we look at and we say, okay, he's going back to the id, right? He's going back to the super ego. He's dealing with the super ego. Abstraction is about problem solving. As we sit up here and talk about his practice of, okay, I made my own paint. I've made this developer. I've had to build my own studio. I've had to construct these platforms and make sure they're perfectly straight. So then when I use the developer, it goes across the right way. Like there's all these things he's doing.
He built a crow's nest.
Right.
Crow's nest. I mean,
yeah,
that's next level. A crow's nest so that he could sit. I think he said at the time he had 13-foot ceilings. So just so that he could get the perspective that he wanted on the work that he was doing, that was obviously
right.
Amazing.
Right. So the thing is like, so he's doing all these things. So you can't say that he's not thinking. He's around major thinkers of abstraction. And abstraction is not just, throwing paint on the surface. It is discovering the materiality of paint, but it's also the theory of painting.
Yeah.
That comes behind it. It is dissecting Velasquez and Titian and Goya, is dissecting the Dogon tribe, is dissecting the metalworkers of Benin, it's the temples in Egypt. It's all of those things compacted into a person and then them put it in a blender, right? Boiling it down into a glaze. So this idea of the civil rights, this idea of like, he was going to Tuskegee. So when we look at Tuskegee Airmen, the purpose of the Tuskegee Airmen was first an experiment by the American government that said that Black people were not intelligent enough to fly a plane, and definitely not in battle. And yet they become one of the most decorated units in World War II. So like, he's kind of like doing away with these ideas. By him painting alone, it becomes activism.
Yeah.
Because he's showing that he can do it. Not only can he do it, he can do it well. not only can he do it well, he can discover new things. Not only can he discover new things, we have other painters that had gleaned from his expertise, like Gerhard Richter, who was making these paintings that were very similar to his, but Gerhard Richter is the one that we recognize.
Right.
Meanwhile, Jack Whitten had already passed that era in his painting and has gone on to something else.
Right.
So even when we look at abstract expression, when we think about jazz and how jazz is influencing abstract expressionism, but no one's really talking about these jazz musicians. We're not talking about the Louis Armstrongs. We're not, who like is one of the inventors of jazz. We're not talking about Charlie Parker, who is one of the inventors along with Dizzy Gillespie, inventing bebop. You know, and then we go to DJ Kool Herc, who then invents with Grand Wizard Theodore and Africa Bambaataa, who are then creating hip hop. Like, these inventions that are happening coincide with the inventions, you know, because like Jack Whitten and Joe Overstreet used to hang out with Sun Ra. So there's all these kind of theories and new things that are happening that by them showing up, simply showing up, without even mentioning they're fighting for their civil rights, as many of them were, by showing up, they're being activists.
He was involved in the civil rights movement before he left for New York. And
Yes.
It's interesting. It goes back to, he talks about his stepdad made his living as a sign painter, and Whitten made signs, you know, and it's interesting. You think about, you know, most of the signs that are used, you know, in public demonstrations and protests today are very sloppily handwritten, you know.
Right.
But you think about the signs from that era, they were proper signs, you know.
They were proper signs.
Yeah. You know, there's something else about Birmingham. You know, he tells a story. It was sometime in the 90s when the Birmingham Museum of Art called to acquire one of his paintings, and he recollected about and just was reflecting on,
I'm sure,
the fact that a museum that wanted to acquire one of his works was one that he was not able to visit as a child.
Right. Birmingham has a very interesting history with its artists. Like, I think Michi Miko, who lives here in Atlanta, who's from Alabama, I think he's probably one of the greatest painters alive right now. One of the greatest artists alive right now. And again, he's from Alabama. Jack Whitten, Birmingham. Thornton Dahl, Birmingham, Bessemer. Lonnie Holly, Birmingham. And I'm always interested, going back to the idea about the land, how does the land birth something so amazing in the midst of, Sun Ra's also from Alabama. How do you birth something so innovative, so amazing in the midst of just very overt apartheid type of racism? Like, how does this rose grow from this concrete? You know, it's just amazing. Like, I look at them and I go, like, how were you able to sustain such tragedies? Because the main reason why Jack Whitten left the South was because one of his friends died during the protest.
Mm-hmm.
So he was like, I can't deal with this anymore. I need to go. So, like, amidst great tragedy, you have these artists create some of the most beautiful work that is still shifting the way we think about art. You know, something that seems so sidelined in a culture like today, right now, right?
Yeah.
Like, why are we thinking about, I mean, this is 2025 and all these things are happening in America, and we are talking about art. I find it really interesting. We're in interesting times.
You mentioned the recipes earlier, and that's such an interesting reference to Jack's background as a pre-med student,
Right.
a physicist. They're really, I would extend that to say they're really formulas, that he invented for himself, and you can just tell that throughout his writing, and the work obviously, supports that.
Well, I spent 25 years in restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
I spent 13 years in fine dining. So recipe is, my language.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So him being a scientist, formula would be more of his language.
Let's get into the book.
Okay.
You indulged me in sharing the quotes that you wanted to talk about today,
okay.
And, which I appreciate, which gave me some time to revisit them.
Okay.
So we're just going to go in sort of chronological order here from page 48. And by the way, I haven't referenced this specifically. Here's the book for those of you that are watching on YouTube. It is Notes from the Woodshed. Yes. So on page 48, art in its advanced stage is something more than therapy. The modern day realist gives us art as therapy. Rothko gives us art as dedication to painting.
I think it goes back to the idea of art being a solo sport that is beyond therapy. I think you have to do the therapy before you get to the studio.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to do therapy alongside your studio practice.
For sure.
I have seasons where I have to do therapy. It's very easy to get caught up in your own thoughts while you're in the studio, and sometimes need distractions while you're in the studio. So it's advanced to therapy because you have to deal with those things because you are spending so much time alone. But also the level of expression and really being direct in what it is you want to say.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to go through it over and over and over again in order to really kind of fine tune it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where doing 10 helps you do that. Sometimes when we talk about painting, people go, "Oh, it's like therapy. You're in the room by yourself and you're moving your hand." And yeah. And sometimes it feels like therapy and sometimes it feels like work.
Yeah.
Like construction. It feels, especially for you, I've done that kind of work before, and now I'm like, no, I'm not into that. I'm more into this other thing. Still labor.
Yeah.
But in that labor, you're working something out. You're not just working your body, you're working your mind. You're asking yourself questions. You are, even when I was dyeing fabric, it was still, okay, if I leave it here for 30 minutes, what color will it be? If I leave it here overnight, what will it be? If I leave it here for 3 hours, what would it be? Or rinse it out. I don't rinse it out. What would happen? Like there's all these things that are happening. So it's that Rothko dedication to painting.
Yeah.
But I don't know. You tell me, what do you think? Do you think that Winston was as dedicated to painting as he was to making the thing?
Not at all. No. And he talked about that a lot, when he made the transition between thinking about, changing the verb from painting to making.
Right.
Jack was a maker. I mean, and you think about, so talking about your background in the restaurant industry, the fact that Jack was a very skilled carpenter, cabinetry maker. I mean, that's a big thing that and especially early on in the book, that's what he had to do to support himself. I mean, we talked before off camera the other day about the 3 years that he had to take off to rebuild his studio,
right?
From scratch,
right,
and that he had to support the financial burden of rebuilding the studio by doing a bunch of side jobs.
Right.
It is interesting though. You think about all of the things that influence and affect an artist's practice and approach to making. But his desire to study both the scientist and the builder, there's both precision, I mean, when you're building, he talks about, when he was building his platform, he describes it, 2x4 studs, 16-inch centers, 3/4 construction grade, I mean, he gives the recipe, he gives the plans, right? Basically, it's been interesting. I have somewhat of a background in construction, moderately skilled, mostly I was just an unskilled laborer in high school and in college, but just being around it, that stuck with me, being around my grandfather who was a woodworker, and just watching and just absorbing, those different things had a huge impact. We're in the final stages of building a sauna in our backyard. And thankfully I've got a very skilled builder friend who's doing most of the thinking and planning.
Yeah.
Because, it requires precision. I mean, the work that I make, as long as the frames are square, and I've gotten away from frames as well. But, apart from that, it's all it's open, it's free. It's, it's not any, but just in observing Rob, my friend who's helping me, watching and observing how many times he, the old, measure twice, cut once.
Yes.
It's, and how, especially when you're trying to make things are plumb and square, but just all of the ways that background clearly influenced Whitten's work, and his ability, to make.
Right. What's funny to me is you live in Minnesota and you're getting a sauna where you could just come to Atlanta from July to August and just stand outside.
That's partially true. Yeah.
You won't have a sauna.
we get triple.
So I love the fact that you're building a sauna, and from like June to October, I live in a sauna.
Well, I mean, listen, when this thing gets going, we're gonna have that thing ripping at 190 to 210 degrees. So I mean, it's a step above. It's a step above. That's what the cold.
I don't know. If you're down here in Atlanta, sometimes it feels like 190. I spent a lot of my time when I was younger in Birmingham, Alabama. Because I told you my parents lived there, so grew up there. Mm-hmm. So my mother lives in Riggins, and my father lived in Docena. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. They met in Columbus, Ohio. They're 13 years apart, and so we would go there, and they lived 20 minutes apart from each other. Mm-hmm. So we would go back every summer, every spring. And when my grandmother was going down in health, we would go during the wintertime as well. Mm-hmm. But I would spend a lot of time on that front porch at Dad's old house. And that's where I learned abstraction at a very young age. And I didn't realize it until I was in grad school, kind of like going back over my life, kind of building my thesis. But that front porch where I was able to look out and see the houses that were in front of the railroad track. Mm-hmm. And then there was woods behind that. So there was like these evergreen trees behind that. Then there was the train going. And then there was a house in front of it. And then there was a street lamp. And then like I was told to go count train cars as the sun's going down. Mm-hmm. So, counting train cars is really an activity to get the kids at the house. Like, we want to talk some adult business, and we're going to give you an activity. So, I'm running outside. I go, okay, and I'm 99, 100, 102. I just counted 106 cars. Oh, great. There's another train coming. Just wait on it. And then you count the next 150 cars, right? But seeing those trains go past those colorful houses, and in between the colorful houses, because you see it in between, then you see the trees behind that, and then you see the sun setting behind that, is where I begin to understand. My mother was a photographer. So at around 5 years old, she taught us how she would just hand you a camera and say, okay, you go over there and take pictures over there. I'm gonna be taking pictures over there, like at a family reunion or a family function or something. Mm-hmm. So you learn how to begin looking at things through a square. So that's part of the reason why paintings are never really square is because I've been looking through a square my whole life, but looking through that square and then knowing how to look through that square. If you imagine, shotgun houses in front of a train going by, and that is the background is evergreen trees as the sun goes down, you can see then how color and light and form, mm-hmm. but relieving the shape as Cézanne did, relieving that and just leaving the form, how you begin to conceive abstraction at an early age. Yeah. Without knowing it. So I would get in trouble all the time because I would take pictures of the sunset, or I'd take pictures of a bird flying. And my mother would be like, Jamel, what is this? What is this? What are you taking pictures of? There's pictures take money. It's film. I pay for this. You can't just be put somebody in the picture. Don't just be taking random pictures of things. Yeah. But now, right, my vision that I was seeing at 10 years old or 15 years old when I was taking this random picture of the sky, now that's the qualification, right? That's the qualification. I've been seeing these things forever. Yeah. Was not forever, but as long as I've been here. So these ideas about dedication to painting, mm-hmm. right? When we come back to this idea about dedication to painting, you talk about this idea of being a carpenter, but learning these different skills, learning how to cook, learning. The one thing I learned from restaurants, I used to work at this restaurant here in Atlanta called Blue Ridge Grill, and everything had to be fresh. They actually picked food out of a garden, or vegetable out of a garden, and then it was farm to table before I understood what farm to table was. Mm-hmm. Right. So these ideas about freshness. So it's hard for me to give somebody paintings that I did last year. Because I want them to have something fresh. Yeah. And so all of those things, the same way that Jack Whitten was thinking about this dedication to painting, mm-hmm. or this advanced therapy. Yeah. Like it's all part of practice.
All right. Page 52. The ultimate meaning of abstraction in painting is to be found in the true nature of the paint used. Paint is the vehicle. I am the medium. I do not believe in preconceived ideas in painting. The response to painting must be immediate. There must be no time to think.
Mm. Do you think he's talking about the viewer's perspective or his perspective?
I read that as his perspective.
Okay.
How do you read it?
I would read it as his perspective, but thinking about the viewer, because I often think about the viewer only from the perspective of history, that the viewer doesn't see things as immediate as we do.
Sure.
But I do see the gesture as immediate, which I find fascinating. Yeah. How direct some of his work is. When I think about the history, when I think about these ideas of like primitivism, like Henri Rousseau, or when you look at painting created by self-taught painters, where there's no linear perspective and everything's just very direct, right? Mm-hmm. And when I think about this level of immediacy that's happening in his work, it's that gesture. It's that like how did you do that? That one little mark. Yeah. Like when he leaves those little like pebbles inside of those paintings where he's using the developer, mm-hmm. by him scraping that rock through that. Who else does that is Mark Bradford. He leaves mm-hmm. these little things in behind the painting where he can pull it up, right? Mm-hmm. That relief, adding that, right. Mm-hmm. Also adding that subtraction, what it is subtraction, right? I think he's also talking about when we go back to that third eye, like it's like immediate, like, oh yes, that's it. That's it right there.
There's an excellent podcast that has a couple of interviews with Jack. That
is it? I thought it was called Just Make Art.
No, this is like a proper podcast where they actually come themselves. It's the Modern Notes podcast, episode 699. I sent it to you, but I would highly recommend if anybody listening is a fan of Whitten's, or hopefully we can convert you if you weren't before. But it's excerpts from 2 interviews, with Jack. But he talks about in that interview, which I believe were recorded in 2013, 2014. But he talks about the process of construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction.
Okay.
Thinking about that in those three distinct phases, it's and just hearing him speak as well is fascinating.
Yes,
so this quote. So this was he wrote this in 1973. So just to put things in context, this is after he had made a very intentional choice to remove all gesture from his work. He realized how heavily influenced he was by de Kooning specifically, and now he wanted to. And he speaks about this in this interview. But he said, I realized, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, I realized that I was making the same sort of repetitive marks that were all within that ABEX, school of thought. And he wanted to remove that. So in the context of this particular excerpt, paint is the vehicle. I am the medium, not the brush. He pretty much set the brush aside completely.
Right.
Going forward. Yeah. All right, so this ended up being a much longer conversation than we had anticipated. We probably should have expected it. They often have a way of doing that. So we decided to break this up into 2 parts. So join us next time on Just Make Art for part 2 on Jack Whitten with Jamel Wright Sr. Bye.